adding to the fever of this era was not just the growth of industrial jobs and factories and criticisms of capitalism, but wealth. You have a need for workers. You have people out, perhaps, maybe in rural areas who are tired of the farming and rural doldrums of maybe cyclical poverty out in farms. Um, you also have an abundance of factory jobs in towns and cities. So you had a move, my voice cracked, you have a move of people from out into rural areas into cities. And then as you still had an abundance of jobs, you have immigration that really starts to take place at this time. Now, in this era of American history, in the late 1800s, you still had a majority of people coming from Northern Europe, Ireland, and the British Isles, places like that. Um, you did start to see in this era, and we're going to talk in the next chapter about America's next wave of massive immigration, okay? Because you started to see some people come from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, so in other words, Poland and Italy, but other places as well. But around this area, you still largely had Northern Europeaners, and then also you had an influx of Chinese and Mexican immigrants as well. So you started to see some various different things, and some of these companies would actually pay for immigrants to come here. They would pay their passage and then just deduct it out of their pay once they actually got into the factories. Because many of these jobs did not require skilled labor. So anybody could be trained to do various different things like hanging a chicken on a hail ring as it goes around the line, I guess. I don't know. Otherwise, though, it was during this era that because you now have different ethnicities coming to America, they're competing culturally. You have Chinese immigrants competing with Mexican immigrants. You have Northern Europeaners who are competing with Eastern and Southern Europeans. So oftentimes you have ethnic strife among different immigrant populations who have different interests, who have different sources of power. So you have competition among some of the immigrant classes, and they struggle amongst one each other. Okay, that's nothing new in American history. As far as the actual conditions themselves, oftentimes in a factory, you have moving parts, you have dank conditions, it's hot. You often work a very repetitive job, sometimes doing very tough labor. If you're an unskilled worker, if you don't have a specific trade, it may not matter if you're a male who can lift a lot or anything like that. Some of these factory jobs did not require high amounts of skill. Therefore, if you were a female who was looking for a job, or if you were a child, 8 years old perhaps, you were eligible to work in a factory, working long, laborious jobs in intense heat, very monotonous work, and you could be overworked 6 days a week. Now, at the time of this recording, I have a 7-year-old son, and my younger son is 4, he'll be 5 next month. I cannot imagine my sons working in a factory. But it was realistic at that time. You had a number of children, young boys especially, who would often wander factories barefoot, working textile machines all throughout the East Coast, and cotton mills, replacing things, working various different machinations. You have very long and monotonous work that oftentimes children are doing. And then women were oftentimes subject to various different industries as well, particularly the sewing industry. And so you may have sewing and textile mills and whatnot. And then you may also have other industries to where they're in like domestic service, or maybe perhaps they're working at home. Domestic service was generally the most common female occupation. And oftentimes these jobs, these children and these women would work for lower wages. They were just looking to perhaps get out of their house, or maybe try and provide for themselves, or maybe just try and have a new opportunity for various different things. But it was around this time that in the late 1800s, you had nearly 2 million children working in factories. Um, that's an alarming number. And so there would be a big movement to try and curb that number so as not to exploit children. It's one thing for working adults who may be oppressed in their own right, but at least they're adults. Children being overworked at that age? Mm-mm. You have some labor laws in the late 19th century that were geared towards curbing the idea of children working in factories. So nowadays, you have to be of a certain age. I believe it's 16, but maybe with an exemption at 15 to work a job. Okay, and that is to protect children from being monopolized and overworked, especially if they're highly laborious type jobs. 8-year-old kids don't need to be doing high intense labor, working out in textile mills or out in fields or anything like that. And it's really, really awful to see that this goes on in various different parts of the world. Asia in particular, there are a number of child workers who are exploited. And oftentimes these are people who are making your Air Jordans, or they are making the clothes that you buy at various different retailers, or an athlete's peddling a certain line of clothes. They're oftentimes made by child laborers overseas. So think about that next time you see some of those things. Otherwise, though, there were people who were looking for ways to set a various minimum wage around this era, but then also a maximum amount of work hours, a standard work day. Okay, so hold that thought. There were growing numbers of people who felt powerless as a laborer, but they felt more powerful if they were to unite for a certain labor cause. It was during this era of industrialization in American history that you started to see the advent of modern day unions. And these unions would serve the purpose to represent the interests of the worker so as not to be exploited, and to have better working conditions, better pay, better working hours, child labor laws. You started to see the emergence of unionization, especially in and around railroads. Railroads and railroad workers oftentimes have very large manipulatable opportunities for exploitation. And you have various different workers in the railroad industry who would often unite and would sometimes violently protest to get their message across. You would have perhaps secret societies. Maybe they would try and battle management in secret fashion, perhaps violently. But otherwise, you have more noble organizations like the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, who took the idea that they would represent mainly skilled workers so as to obtain better working conditions and better pay. And that was something that they really wanted to espouse. They would often demand the AFL idea, or the AFL really worked to create an 8-hour workday. So today, you may work a full-time job, you work 40 hours a week, 8 to 5 with an hour break or a few different things built in for lunch. They called for a general strike if these were not met, these demands were not met. And strikes became a demonstration to demand a shorter workday and better pay. So One way to get your point across so as not to be exploited is to go on strike and hold up the railroads. Goods aren't going to be transported if you're not working. Go on strike, okay? And going on strike is a noble form of protest. Hey, there are inequities in my working condition. I'm not going to work, and I'm going to even put my job and livelihood on hold to send the message that I will not be exploited. Okay, there's a lot to be said for that. The problem is a lot of the strikers at that time started to become violent, and they started to square off with authorities or anything else, and they would oftentimes lead to violence that would kill people or anything else, and they would be deemed as anarchists. And anarchy, the lack of any sort of establishment boundaries or government, so you will, oftentimes is associated with violence. So you see some of this in today's era, in the Corona and George Floyd era, where you have very peaceful protesters who are protesting against injustices in our world, and then there's a small faction of them who are all about chaos and creating violence and throwing Molotov cocktails at police or burning buildings and inciting riotous acts that are beyond peaceful protest. It's counterproductive to do that. You're turning people against you at that point. What may be an opportunity to gain empathy, you turn away by blowing stuff up. Okay? So some of these movements need to potentially reconsider just how they could be viewed. Anarchism could potentially be viewed by people as terrorism. And when you're throwing Molotov cocktails and blowing up buildings and burning businesses and whatnot, yeah, okay. So oftentimes business leaders would smear unions for not stopping this sort of behavior in our industrial era. So that would be something to perhaps keep in mind. Maybe you can balance these different types of things. But you would have various other different strikes all across the country that would get the message across. But in due time, it would happen. And oftentimes workers, even though new laws would be enacted, sometimes the business leaders would kind of scoff and laugh at them and claim that they were weak. Okay, so there are various other different things that come into play during this era. But the biggest thing that you need to know for this class and in general is that the industrial era brought massive amounts of innovation that affect the world to this day. American innovation, can-do attitude, thoughtfulness. You can lift yourself up from nothing. A true rags to riches type opportunity. Like Andrew Carnegie, Horatio Alger. Great. How can we maybe harness that so it doesn't get out of control? And how can we perhaps maybe provide a better opportunity for workers? So the industrial era in American history led to an industrial supremacy that runs America to this day as a major world power in that regard. America changes the world. That's awesome. There are some drawbacks. Okay, you've got to rein in those who are exploited for their labor. You got to work to gain better rights. And in this era, you saw a number of people fight for the idea of a modern workday as being 8 hours a day, better pay, better benefits and working conditions, and labor laws that would provide for workers' compensation if you had workers who became injured on the job, child labor laws that would prohibit children from being exploited. And so you have new situations that would arise because of the industrialization of our country. Okay? And it was also in this era that things would start to be recognized and done about them. The plight of workers and their condition, children. All of those things affect us to this day. So discussions about how women are paid equal pay for equal jobs, other different aspects came out about that time, and they affect us to this day. So discussions are very important. And it's important to understand where things happen. And it's important to understand and look at things from multiple angles so as to be truly informed about what you see in the news and what you hear from your friends on social media or anything else along those lines. You want to be truly informed. Look at things from multiple angles. Okay? Understand the greatness of the era. Understand the drawbacks of the era and how they merged and how they produced various different things that affect us to this day. So that is the industrialization of America. We emerged as an economic superpower during that era. Other things down the line will emerge to make us a true superpower in that regard. And in the next chapter, I alluded to immigrants. We're going to talk about large immigration to the United States.